Hi, I'm Shannon Ethridge, best-selling author and leader of a mentorship program called BLAST, which stands for Building Leaders, Authors, Speakers, and Teachers. And one of the first applicants ever to that program, once we created it, was Kenny Ortiz. So I've had the pleasure of watching him make several presentations to audiences, and he captures their heart every time, and I know that today is going to be no different, and I'm glad that you get to watch. So would you please welcome with me Kenny Ortiz from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
I'd like to share briefly with you from my favorite gospel, the Gospel of Mark. Chapter 10, Jesus, about a week before he dies, is hanging out with his entourage. He's got a crew of people hanging out with him, and he's walking in the town. Mark records it like this. Chapter 10, verse 46. And they came to Jericho. And as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. Picture this, Jesus, God incarnate, is hanging out, walking through a crowd. He's on his way to Jerusalem. And the crowd thinks, the Jews of the time believe that he's going to overthrow the Roman government, that he's going to set up a kingdom here on planet Earth. And so he has an entourage. Most theologians say there's probably at minimum 5,000 to 10,000 people in this huge crowd following Jesus, cheering him on. And there's one guy in the back, a beggar, a blind man, so insignificant that in fact the other Gospels that record this story don't even mention his name. Mark, the only one that mentions his name. Bartimaeus, a blind beggar. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. Let me tell you, many times in our lives there will be people who will tell us to be silent. Many times we will see Jesus and know we need a touch from him. And we cry out, Jesus, Son of David. And people say, shut up. You're a blind beggar. He doesn't care about you. He's going to be the king of the world. What does he care about you, Bartimaeus? I'm here to tell you that he cares about you, Bartimaeus. Even the most insignificant person, or maybe you feel insignificant, to Jesus, you are not insignificant. And many rebuked him, telling him, be silent. But he cried out all the more. When people tell you to be silent, I want to encourage you to cry out all the more. And Jesus stopped and said, call him. And they called the blind man, saying to him, take heart, get up, he's calling you. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and he came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, what do you want from me? Now, sometimes I think we just read through the scriptures very quickly. I would encourage you not to do that. Stop and visualize what's going on. Thousands of people in the crowd, blind man throws off his cloak, runs to Jesus, and Jesus says, what do you want from me? He's blind. I think he wants to be healed. And I think the reason why Jesus asks his questions sometimes is not because he's dumb, not because he doesn't know. It's very obvious what Bartimaeus wanted. It's because Jesus wants us oftentimes to verbalize that which we're believing for. To verbalize what we want. As Matthew 7 tells us, to ask. You have not because you ask not. We can be confident, as 1 John tells us, that if we pray and we ask for something according to his will, then he absolutely hears us. And I know that it's his will to touch our lives and to glorify himself. And so there's no doubt that it is God's will to intervene in the life of Bartimaeus, no matter how insignificant he felt. And Jesus said to him, what do you want from me? And the blind man said, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, go, your faith has made you well. I'll give you a very brief history lesson. In the Roman Empire, if you had a handicap of any kind, you were given a cloak or a jacket of some sort. And depending on the material or the color, it would entitle you to certain provisions. If you were blind, living in Palestine, a cloak of a certain type for a blind man would entitle him to a certain number of meals at the house of the Roman centurion. He could literally go to the house of the Roman centurion, have a good meal, get some groceries, and he would do that about once a week. That's about what we know. And so the reality is, for this blind man, Bartimaeus, his cloak is his meal ticket. his cloak is his only opportunity to get a meal. And so he's got thousands of people here, and he's standing begging. The reality is a cloak on a blind man is worth at least one meal a week, and maybe a few groceries. The chances of that cloak remaining in the ground once he throws it down is almost zero. Remember, there's thousands of people here. So he is blind. He's dependent on this cloak. He rises to his feet. He takes off his cloak, as verse 50 tells us, and throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. He said, I don't need this anymore. The very thing I have relied on my entire life, I don't need this, because I'm getting ready to see Jesus. And so many times in our lives, I think we rely on things outside of Jesus. We rely on other people to give us maybe the approval or the attention we want. Sometimes we rely on things like our credit cards for our finances. We rely on a variety of things, much like Bartimaeus had relied on his cloak. But the ultimate test of faith is, are you willing to throw down the very thing you've relied on all your life? Are you willing to stand up and say, I'm throwing my cloak down and I'm going to Jesus, and I don't care if someone else steals it, because I know I'm about to have an experience, an encounter with the Son of David. And I know that by the time I get to him, he's going to touch my life. And this is why Jesus says to him, what do you want from me? He goes, I want to be made well. And Jesus says, the faith you've already demonstrated, Bartimaeus, by throwing down your cloak, and in spite of the people telling you to shut up, speaking all the louder, Jesus, Son of David, was the response that Jesus wanted and longed for. And that was a response that motivated God to touch and intervene in his life. It's no record.